Welcome to How to Deal When the Shit Gets Real podcast. I'm Rietta, and today I'm here with Dr. Jackie Layton. So, Jackie, how do you deal when the shit gets real? Or just tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'll do both. So I am a trauma psychologist and a mom and entrepreneur. So the shit is usually real. and I work with a lot of really lovely folks who are fellow trauma survivors and cycle breakers. So I've put a lot of thought into how to approach it when things start to feel overwhelming, when I start noticing my own signs of anxiety, burnout, and anything else. I have the approach I do when I'm doing well by myself, like the thing I aim for and get maybe 80% of the time, which is if you think of our typical urge when something doesn't feel good is we want to very quickly kind of hot potato our emotion and jump into action because we're like, this doesn't feel good. We just need to solve it. It's kind of like when you're having a conversation with a friend and you mention something uncomfortable and they're immediately like, how can I just give you advice to make this discomfort, my worry for you, go away, right? So I try to do intentionally the opposite of that for myself. So if I notice that I'm starting to feel it in some way or another, I will make myself actually sit down, slow down, and peel apart the thing that I am feeling. So I'll sit there and say, okay, are any of my oldies but goodies coming up? You know, like the hyper self-criticism showing up, catastrophizing. Like if I mess this up, it's going to mean that somehow my business tanks and we'll be living at the in-laws. Like I'm like, okay. And so I'll do like the checks of like, okay, are any of the oldies but goodies coming up? We'll cast those aside. We know that's just what our brain does when we're worried. And then I'll check in with like, are any old patterns coming up that don't fit for this, right? Like self-blame and things like that, where I'm like, also not the most helpful. And then I can get into the, what am I actually feeling right now? Like, what does that tell me about what matters? What's something I can do that relates to what matters once we clear away all the other noise? And that tends to help me just center in and slow down, and things tend to work a lot better. And I will say on the days that I have low capacity, those 20% of the time, then I get long hugs and, I drink too much caffeine and I snuggle in with our girls or our dog and just kind of give myself a moment before I try to make my mature approach to whatever's going on. Yeah.
I feel like it's a sign that both you and my last guest both mentioned burnout. So just going to go back to that just for a second. I know everybody's different, obviously, but is there any red flags, any signs people can look out for that they're headed towards burnout?
Oh, yeah. It's a great question. So some of the things that I would say to keep an eye out for, if you start noticing yourself feeling really tired and you're not quite sure why, or noticing that it's difficult to motivate yourself to get up and going or started on projects, you find that maybe things you actually typically like, you just don't have the energy for, you find yourself wanting to procrastinate and avoid. If you find yourself getting more irritable, like it feels like, it's like, why am I so impatient? Why does this feel so heavy? This normally isn't that bad for me. Those are all signs. You're probably stretched a bit too thin. You're probably needing some more support. You're probably feeling mentally tired. Those are initial signs, but the other issue we have with burnout is that we talk about burnout like it's an individual thing, when really burnout is typically our reaction to greater systems or societal pressures that are not sustainable for us as a single human. And so it is our sign, but not that something's wrong with us. It's our sign that the amount of resources we have are not enough for the storm we're trying to weather, and that we need to like slow down and get support. Yeah, that's how I do it.
No, I like that, and I think that's super helpful, especially the reference to the storm. Like, I think most people can relate to that reference.
Yeah.
So, what inspired you to become a psychologist, and specifically one that focuses on trauma? I'm sure that's not easy. Granted, I know psychologists deal with that a lot in general, but like you really decided to hone in on that.
Yeah. So I would say probably because I was thinking about anticipating this as a topic and thinking about it. So I think when I really knew that I wanted to dedicate my career to trauma was I was volunteering at a domestic violence shelter on their crisis and resources line. So when folks were frightened for their safety, experiencing abuse, trying to get out of the house, I was the person on the phone with them that was helping like calm them down, talk them through it. Here's what you put in the bag, coordinating this person's coming to pick you up. We're going to get you to the shelter, going to get you safe. And then helping them get access to whatever they needed to get the kids to school the next day or whatever it was going to be. And that it was about as heavy as it sounded. And there's something really cool about getting to have those um, moments where I could see just how powerful it is to have somebody there genuinely caring and listening to you and just trying to problem solve with you. And I remembered times in my own life when I had experienced trauma and abuse and I didn't have that. And I saw like what it looked like for somebody to have somebody just 100% there with them, not shying away from how scary or heavy it was and just working in the trenches with them. And I kind of fell in love with it. I just wanted to give that to as many fellow survivors as possible and in as best a way we could. And so I didn't know at first how I was going to do that. I wasn't sure how I wanted to serve trauma survivors. I just knew that was going to be my life's work in some way. And it was during college, eventually down the line, when I noticed myself just getting pulled towards psychology specifically. I was working in a post-traumatic growth research lab and looking at trying to understand like why was it that some of the folks I was seeing, they were going through and they were developing PTSD. Some folks came out back to baseline. That was a majority. A majority of folks go right back to baseline after a month or two. And then I was noticing some folks, this about equal amount as the folks who developed PTSD developed what we call post-traumatic growth. So like they were actually closer in their relationships, had deeper meaning and purpose, and all these beautiful things. And so I went into this volunteering in this psychology research lab trying to understand that. And while I was doing that work, I realized I was not only in love with trauma, but psychology. And I wanted to do specifically, you know, psychological treatment for folks who were going through trauma.
Do you think working in that sphere has also helped heal your own trauma?
Oh goodness, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I highly recommend therapy to everybody, not just because I give it, but because I have had such wonderful experiences myself actually being able to just sit down, work through therapy. And there's also been a sort of parallel that I've noticed that um, in a lot of ways, I feel like being a psychologist, I get to be the thing I needed for a lot of folks, which is somebody who just entirely centered on the person who's going through it, not trying to push their own ideas or their own solutions on you, but actually like helping you find the ones you care about and taking the time to do it. And that's really nice. And then I think the other thing too is that um, in working in trauma, it's comforting to get to see the best side of humanity. Like I get to see folks coming in the typically worst place of their lives, like they've just experienced some of the worst things they'll ever experience. Um, and then as we're working together, they're so reaffirming of my faith in humanity. The people I get to work with are really inspiring and lovely. And you see them doing this incredibly courageous thing of opening up to a stranger, but with this hope that maybe things could be better. And there's something really cool. Like we all as humans have that where when we are going through things, when the shit gets real, like there's still this part of us that's like, I bet I can get through this though, right? Like I wonder if somehow there could be more than this, or it could be better than this, if I could just get connected, if I could just do the right steps, right? And there's something really cool about that. Like people are scrappy and lovely. So
Yeah, and you're healing your own inner child and their inner child and yeah, all
yeah.
the things. Um what, if you're willing to, what kind of trauma did you have to go through and brought you
Yeah.
to the other side?
Yeah, the main trauma that I went through was childhood, so childhood abuse, pretty severe, and for all of it. And so there's, I say it with a smile, and I shouldn't, because that's a coping. It's like a weird
Yeah.
coping thing.
It
But
is a weird coping thing, I think, for a lot of us because you're just like, I don't know
yeah,
what to do with my face. I'm just
yeah,
gonna do something.
right. Yeah, no, so as a kid, I grew up in a family where early on, right when I was born, the relationship between my parents was very violent and abusive, and so they thankfully divorced. They needed to divorce. It was best for everybody. But the unfortunate thing is that in our family, they continue to have so much just hatred and vitriol for each other. And since I was one, they had really only had the one thing in common, which was me. And so whenever they wanted to harm each other, do any sort of like narcissistic abuse towards each other, they had one vessel that they could do it through.
Mm,
And so there was, I think it ranged from little things like I'm not going to take care of her, do her diaper, do things like that when she's really little so that it all has to land on the next parent. But that meant lots of like hospitalizations and things for me. And then as I was older, it became more severe, like trying to purposefully do things that would get me upset or hurt or traumatized that it had to be the other parent's problem to solve it. And yeah, they were just at a different point. My parents is, I don't mean this to like, call them out as humans.
of
I
course.
don't mean it that way, but the place that I came into the world to two folks who weren't ready to be parents. And they were having a lot of pain. They had a lot of their own trauma. There was a ton of generational trauma that came down. They blocked a good amount of that generational trauma from some of the things they went through. They did block a good amount and keep it from hitting me, but a good amount also came down and hit me. And so I grew up with a lot of patterns of trying to be an adult when I was still a kid. I grew up with patterns of knowing and anticipating scary anger or abuse for the slightest, provocation. So I grew up in this very like tiptoeing way. And it took a lot of healing as an adult to start realizing that a lot of these things I learned, like the internal alarm system I so carefully developed, was not made for the life that I'm thankfully now living. Like it wasn't made for life outside of such a volatile home
Yeah.
experience. So yeah, so once I got out into the world, I realized, oh shoot, like I have all these defenses, I have all these ways of thinking about things. They don't serve me out here in the world. Like it's not helpful to be um, people pleasing and super perfectionistic and full of self doubt out in the world, because the world wants me to be independent and full of confidence and setting clear boundaries, doing all of these things. And I had to start learning all of that essentially at 18 when I left the house, which is something I see a lot actually in the folks I work with. Like we all kind of share this delayed start on getting to learn how to be human and have everything like do all the things that we otherwise could have maybe started experimenting with a little sooner.
Yeah. I mean, that had to be super hard because, at 18, you should be, as prepared as you can be. Obviously, at 18, none of us are truly completely prepared, but you
Yeah.
were a little behind the pack. Do you have a relationship with your parents now, or is it? Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah, we've all been to therapy. We've all done our
That's good.
it's not for everyone. I think a lot of the folks I work with have found a lot of peace cutting off parents who have similar patterns to my parents. It's just that in my particular case, it made sense to maintain the relationship. I think there's also some cultural things there. I grew up closest to my Indian side of the family, and there are a lot of cultural norms for better or for worse where we try to really maintain the relationship in some level, that you really try not to let go of family. And I think that sometimes it's to folks' detriment for their health. But in my case, because my folks are actually really trying to work on it, it feels like right now a nice, safe relationship. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
I
and
wouldn't
that's
have
the
said the same
difference.
thing a while ago.
Yeah, they're working on it. That's the difference. If a parent
Mhm.
hasn't changed and they're still
Yeah.
narcissistic or whatever it might be, yeah, I could see cutting it off would be the better solution. But I'm glad y'all at least reached a place um where you at least respect each other, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Kind
Yeah.
of.
I don't know if I would go that far, but yes, we've hit a point where I don't feel hurt by their disapproval anymore.
Okay.
I have a stronger sense of myself, what my values are, what I want for my family and my girls. And so when we disagree, we're able to disagree, and I hold the boundary for all of us so
Good
that
for
the
you.
relationship is what it can be. But yes, I don't accept I don't accept certain things anymore. And I think they've learned that I'm not loosening up those boundaries. So they do kind of live within them so that they can have access to our relationship. And they really love their grandchildren. And so they like being able to see the girls and everything. So I'm like, yeah, we can all see the girls, but there's certain things we do not do with the girls, and neither will anybody in this house. And so we
Good.
just hold those firm. Mm-hmm.
Good for you. So what do you believe is an important first step or essential step on the road to healing?
Yeah, it's a really great question. Sometimes I think the first step is it's kind of one of the harder ones. I think that you have to hit this point where at least some part of you, however small, realizes that you are worth more, that you are worthy of healing, you are worthy of the time and investment that it takes to do that healing, and that you deserve kindness in a way that you may not be having at the moment from yourself or from others. And I do think that I think that's the main first step. Because if you think about reaching out to a therapist, for instance, it's such a vulnerable thing to do to like reach out to a complete stranger and
It
open up
is.
our world to them, right? Yeah. Like you have to have a good reason to want to do that. You have to have enough hope that it could be worth that level of awkward that it would be worth actually trying such a strange thing compared to what our society normalizes. Our society doesn't normalize open, vulnerable sharing. I wish we did, but it's very strange. And so reaching out to therapy is a very strange experience. And I think that if you don't have at least some part of you saying, but I could have more and I think I deserve more, I don't think it's something that's very easy to do.
Yeah. I mean, I had that epiphany myself when I was going to therapy because, like, when you think about it too, your therapist knows like your deepest, darkest secrets and you know like nothing about them. So it feels very one sided too, where you're like, man, if something
Yeah.
went awry here, they know all my stuff and I know nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a lot. It is a very different relationship. I think there's something that does feel a little bit weird when you like from the therapist side, like I know so much about these folks and they know some things about me. I'm a pretty open person. So like if they ask and I will share, but even the things that I share, I will share what I feel is also helpful for them to hear. So like I
Mhm.
will share honestly, but I'll usually only give them the amount that is helpful for them to hear in this moment. So I'll think about like why are they asking? They're probably wanting to have a sense like am I alone in this or whatever it might be. So I might be vulnerable and share an example from my own life with them, but more just so they don't feel alone and that I don't go any further because it's not about me, it's about them, right? So
Right.
even the sharing is like all about them. Like what is it about what is it I could do to help connect with this person so they don't feel alone or so they can see an example that's helpful or things like that. So, yeah, even when you open up about yourself, you're still not really opening up for yourself like you would in a regular conversation. You're specifically opening up just what that person probably needs from you.
Yeah, I guess we're just gonna have to send this podcast episode to all your patients.
Yeah, I do hear that some of my patients like check out my Instagram and things like that, and they're like, "Your dog is so cute. Your kids are cute." It's like, so I'm not. Yeah, I'm definitely not the blank slate therapist, anyways. But
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
totally
they
teasing, by
don't
the
tend to
way.
hear. Yeah.
But that leads perfectly into another question that I had for you. Do you believe that we can truly get over our trauma completely, or is there always going to be like little parts that hang around?
I think it depends on what, when you say get over the trauma completely, like it depends, I guess, on how you're seeing that. If you're thinking about like, could we ever live in a fully, fulfilled, happy way without symptoms of PTSD or symptoms of depression and anxiety? Yeah, for sure. Like I see that. I see that all the time in my work with folks. So we actually have really great treatment options for trauma. You have some of the gold standards: cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure, EMDR. Narrative exposure is really lovely, especially for folks with more complex trauma or who want to kind of tether apart cultural things. So there's a lot of really wonderful treatments for trauma. And what we tend to see is that as we're doing that processing and that work, um, the symptoms we know of as post trauma can resolve. So, trauma really isn't, I guess I should say, trauma really isn't the event that we go through or the experience we have. It's our reaction afterwards and our way of healing afterwards. So, we tend to be, our brain is continuously learning and adapting. Even having this conversation, or folks who are listening to this podcast, like all of our brains are wiring as we're listening to this. Like our brains are shifting even in this moment to accommodate new information, new things that we're experiencing, new feelings we're having, and it's heightening different connections in our brain. So we are a constantly changing being, all of us. And trauma in that way is very temporary. Like it is our experience in that one moment in time. And we're always adjusting our story. We can always reclaim our story. You're never going to be able to like erase past chapters. So, those of us who experience trauma, we can't go in and selectively amnesia it out and cut it out. It'll
That would
always
be
be
nice.
right. It'll always be part of the past story, but we get to write the chapters moving forward. So when it comes to reclaiming life after trauma, absolutely, we all can. The same beautiful brain that was able to develop these heightened alarm systems to the scary things we went through, which is an adaptation, a useful adaptation at the time, that same brain can adjust and calibrate all those systems for what we need moving forward. Like we are really incredible. Even when we're having a trauma response, it's just incredible that hasn't been updated yet.
That whole thing was awesome. I love it. I mean, that was so helpful and informative. So, um,
I'm so
I don't
glad.
even, I don't even have a follow up for that. But what has been one of the most like inspirational aspects of your journey as a therapist? Like, has it been a particular client? Has it just been like your journey in general?
Yeah. I have worked with so many amazing clients. And I don't just say that as like, I know people will say that, but like, I have worked with so many amazing clients. I think lately, I feel like the most inspirational part of my work has been the ways that the work I do is kind of, it's like a parallel, kind of like what you mentioned earlier, where I do a lot of my own healing in the work that I'm doing. So I, even getting into this work, I didn't realize early on in my career how much of like me going into this kind of caregiving supportive role was also some of my past, like always the person caring for everybody else, always the mediator. It was a lot of my past stuff that it felt very familiar and easy to kind of be the wallflower that exists for everyone else. Because that's how I survived so much of my life, was being somebody that made themselves useful to others. And so as I was going through my own journey as a psychologist, I had to really undo a lot of the things that I was being reinforced for. So they loved it when somebody's willing to take on all the tough cases, take on a bunch of extra hours, work for less, right? Like people love it when you're willing to do all of that. And it's not sustainable. It's not kind to myself. And so over this course of helping folks do their healing, I feel like I did a lot of my own healing and started to really actually become like a friend and a parent to myself in so many ways. Like we talk about that inner child, but we also kind of have that inner parent figure where we reparent ourselves in so many ways. And I needed to get to the point where I wasn't always telling myself, like, hey, this person needs this from you. Can you just make it happen? Right? Like, I get that you're tired. I get that you're anxious, but like, this person needs it more. So can you just take your energy and give it to them? And finally starting to break away from some of those patterns was, yeah,
It's
amazing.
hard.
It's so hard. It's so hard.
Yeah.
I think I witnessed it in a lot of folks before I really, really felt like I got there myself.
Yeah.
And
Letting go
yeah,
of that people pleasing is hard because, like, especially as women, not to say that men don't do, but especially as women, we're so innate with being nurturing and taking care of others that it's really hard to be like, okay, I don't have the capacity for this anymore. I got to take care of myself.
yeah, 100%. Yeah, I do think that we're rewarded for all the things that tend not to be healthy for us in our culture. Like
Yes.
we're rewarded for giving too much of ourselves. We're definitely rewarded for that like hustle and grind. And I know one of the big one of the big things I did in my career that really showed me like I am living differently now. I am cycle breaking now. Is I had been very hyper focused on stability and safety, like getting something reliable and stable for myself, since it's not something I really had felt I had emotionally and otherwise before. And so, man, I worked so hard to get myself through college. I was the first in my immediate family to even go to college, let alone go all the way up to a doctorate. And I don't think they really understood it. So they weren't dismissive is a bit harsh, but like it definitely wasn't as supportive because it's definitely a family where they're like, why wouldn't you just go into business? You know, like you could be, and I did eventually in an ironic way, coming back around to business. But yeah, I went in and the things that I was getting most reinforced for were all actually not the right fit for me. And I realized when I got into this very desired position in the VA. I was getting to lead PTSD substance use team, create my own program. I was going to get, they were saying, you know, you can pick who you have working under you and you get to choose your hours. And you only answer to this one human who was a lovely human. So it was considered this fantastic get. And they were offering a raise. Like it was all the things that we are told we should want from a job. And all I could think to myself was like, if this is what we're all supposed to want, like, why am I not happy about it? Like, all I can see is all the hours I'm going to be putting in, the unhealthy work environment. Like, I realized, like, I wished somebody would just like come in and like, like rescue me away from it all. And I was like, I'm that person though, right? Like, I'm that hero that gets to rescue me from this. And so I turned down this job during my positive review while I was being offered the raise. I was like, I so appreciate it. Like, I very much appreciated it. I'm so flattered. And I will help you with getting all the materials you need for this next human. But I am out in 6 months. I was like, you know, it's time for me to move on. And I went into my own practice. And when I left my federal job, I was pregnant with our first daughter and leaving maternity leave that they would have offered for the unknowns of going into my own business. And I just felt so good. I danced in the parking lot after I gave them my ID cards and like all of my access had been given in and it was all finished. I danced on my way to my car because I was just so
See?
excited that like I did something that went so against all of my conditioning, which is like, if you get that really good job with the good pay that's reliable and stable, like you don't leave that, you suffer to stay. And I was like, no,
Mm.
I want healthy life and work on my own terms. I don't want my kids growing up with mom being overworked and stressed. Like I grew up seeing my mom so
Mhm.
overworked and stressed. And yeah, that was a big turning point where I'm like, wow, old me would never have been able to walk away from such stability, knowing that I could trust myself to make something happen.
I love that for you. And it's just a great reminder too that like we shut ourselves to death, right? We should do this, you should do that.
Mhm.
What about what I actually want instead of what I should do?
Right? Yeah, I think it's also like we get so caught up in trying to live other people's values and expectations. I mean, that's why we're burning out, right? Like we're
Mhm.
all pushing ourselves to live other people's expectations. We're all pushing ourselves to try to do so much when if we slowed down and actually looked at what we want and what we need, we could probably live a much more fulfilled way. Like I know I and a lot of the folks I work with, we make a lot of decisions about fearing the possibilities of what can happen
Mhm.
because we're thinking about it wrong. Like the events around us that can happen, we don't have actual control over most of that. But if we think about it instead as like, if I bring it back to the storm analogy, like if we don't think of it as like, oh, I'm so afraid of storms, if we think of it as like, do I trust my ship? Right? Like, do I feel like I have built a ship that I trust to weather through storms or to be able to adapt? Really, all we're asking is like, there's some part of us that's asking us to trust in ourselves and to give ourselves a chance. And that's to me when I left my stable, oh so great job to go into business, it wasn't because I was thinking, oh, this will be easy, like this will always work out. It's that I trusted that I have the ability to adapt if shit hits the fan. Like if things go wrong, I trust me to adapt, to figure it out, to live by my values and do something with it. And so,
Yeah.
like, when I shifted the narrative to like needing things to work out versus just needing me to be trustworthy, it's opened up so many possibilities and it's been
Yeah.
great.
I think a lot of us live in fear too, right? Fear of what is not going to go right, what could go wrong, what could happen, all those what ifs instead of, like you said, just focusing on what good could actually come from it instead of all the bad. Like we get so caught up in all that fear.
Yeah. Well, and it's our brains are wired to pay more attention to negatives, right? Because that's something we then have to fix or address. And we actually have to take intentional effort to get ourselves to really think about, savor, remember all the things that we've done right. And there's like an exercise we do sometimes where we say, what are three good things? Like, what are three good things that have happened this week? And what did you do, even indirectly, even a long time ago, to make those things possible and come about? And it helps us to start training our brain to notice that, yeah, these things happen or I make mistakes, but also look at all these amazing things I do. Look at all these points I should be getting with myself as a trustworthy person that I can count on. Things that I'm doing right, even along the way, that eventually do mean I have these close, lovely relationships later when I need somebody to lean on, or I have some sort of skill that I developed once upon a time so that I could then use it in moments like this, right? So we can actually do intentional practice to remind ourselves that we are somebody we can count on.
Yeah, I love that. And for people who want to do intentional practice, like I know you just said like three things that are good, but like what
Mhm.
else can you tell people are good for intentional practices that they can put into their life?
Mm. Yeah. One of the things I love is it's kind of breaking down and thinking about our thoughts in the moment. The In any given moment, we have some different conditioned thoughts and beliefs coming up that are products of things that we've been through, things we've heard, situations or roles we've been in, culture around us. And it can be really empowering and liberating to pause in the moment and just notice, like, what are some of the assumptions or beliefs I'm holding in this moment? What are some of the things that I'm holding as true, and how do I actually feel about those things? An example could be, like you had mentioned, the pressure on women, right? To people please, to achieve these like high perfect standards, to put so much more work in to achieve the same outcomes, right? There's a lot of pressures on women. I work with a lot of entrepreneurial women in leadership positions, and so many times in therapy, what's coming up is that these gals are amazing and they're busting their butts in their work and continually being questioned. Their credentials are always questioned, their decisions are always questioned in ways that their colleagues are not. And one of the things we'll break down is like when they're saying things to themselves like, can I really do this though? Or like, am I just an imposter? If I do that, are they all going to realize I'm a fraud? Is like a question I hear a lot. If we take a moment and break that down, like, okay, where does that thought probably come from? Like, is it a familiar thought? Is it an old thought? A new thought? Who in my life might agree or disagree with that thought? And like also then that gives us a sense of the sources, right? If like the only people in your life who would agree with that thought are like the chauvinists at work, that's saying something, right? Versus my best friend, my mom, my partner, like they would disagree, right? Like that's worth more. So we can do kind of checks on thoughts, like put them outside of ourselves and say, just because we're having a thought doesn't mean it's a truth. Like we set it out in front of ourselves and say, okay, is this something that I actually want to use as my compass in this moment? Or is there something that maybe feels more true to me? And I can at least put it on for size, at least try it out, even if I'm kind of walking the steps with a little less confidence than I'd like, and see if that feels more authentic to me, or if it at least gets me closer to my actual goals. I can't tell you how many times the women I'm working with will say, okay, I know my worry is that I'm going to step up there, and once the spotlight's on me, they're all going to think I'm a fraud or an imposter. And instead, I'm going to say, I can see all the things I've done. I know how competent I am. I'm going to see this as an opportunity to go up there and let my competence shine, right? Like just go out there and do what I love doing and assume that people will see it if they're going to see my value, and the ones that don't are not for me anyways, right? Like put ourselves out there. But yeah, things like that. It's a very long answer, but I'd say if we wanted to boil it down into a soundbite, I would say when you notice a thought, don't treat it as your actual truth. Sit with it, check into it, see where it comes from, and decide whether or not that really is something you would author into your own story.
No, I love that you did both because I think the breakdown with the example is good because, you know, like some people, myself included, it helps to hear that breakdown to actually get the example. So I love that you did both because now we have both. So what advice would you give to anyone currently like dealing with trauma or just kind of trying to just figure out like where to go from here?
Yeah. That's a good question. When it comes to, sorry if you can hear my toddler attempting to break into the office.
Good for them.
She's trying so hard. She's using her little kid drawing tablet to try to like wedge the door lock open. So it's honestly, it's impressive.
I was gonna say that's pretty smart.
She's going to literally pick the lock. Okay, so the thing I would say when it comes to recovering from trauma, that's the question, right? Sorry for my distraction.
Oh no, you're fine. Just advice you would give to somebody that's either like just kind of coming to a realization of their trauma or just recovery from trauma, and just any advice you could give to somebody.
Yeah. The first thing I would say is repeating this to yourself as often as it takes, but just that you are absolutely worth the investment. This idea that you are absolutely worth your investment of time and effort to explore what life could be, to reclaim how you want to think about and approach this world, your trauma, the people who might have hurt you, the situations that might have been really unfair or unsafe, don't get to write your whole story because it's yours. And the effort that you're going to spend reclaiming it is vulnerable and it is tough, but you're worth every single moment of that, is kind of the first thing I would tell folks.
I love that. And since you started this amazing business, tell us a little bit more about it and how people can get in touch with you if they want to work with you.
Yeah. So my practice is called Mockingbird Therapy and Assessment, Mockingbird Therapy. And you can find me at mockingbirdtherapy.com. So it is a trauma-focused therapy practice where I tend to work a lot with folks who have any kind of trauma, but mostly folks who are coming in with childhood and generational trauma, interpersonal trauma like abuse or sexual trauma. And I work a lot with veterans too, who have combat and interpersonal and all these different types of trauma that they're coming in with. So yeah, you can definitely find me there if you're ever wanting to check in about services or assessment, anything like that. I also offer coaching and support for entrepreneurs and creatives and working parents, anybody who is experiencing trauma patterns showing up in their workplace. So noticing those hyper independence urges, like difficulty counting on others or delegating, difficulties with self-doubt and fears that are keeping them from living their best life, working their best work, I guess. So I work with a lot of entrepreneurs, creatives, and fellow providers and other folks on burnout and kind of discovering this sense of more fulfilled and values focused work, because I genuinely don't subscribe to the capitalistic idea that work has to be centered in our life. I think that we can, even those of us who are doing things that are incredibly important to us, like, I would say the work that I do is my life's work. I am so passionate about what I do. And I still sincerely believe that I'm a human first, and that so should other providers, activists, working parents. Like, I think everybody should get to also be their human selves first, and that work should be something that helps us find purpose and safety and liberation rather than something that takes us away from the life we could be living.
Yeah. And you said you had a free guide, correct?
Yes, yeah. I put together a guide on burnout, and it actually takes a similar approach to what we've been talking about today, where it's designed so that it's not like the burnout guides I was seeing. Coping skills are lovely. They have their time and place. I love mindfulness. So all of that is really lovely. But because burnout is so much like us feeling the weight of systems around us, I developed the burnout guide so that if people wanted to start questioning and doing practices of, what are some of these thoughts and beliefs I'm experiencing that are pushing me to react to or take on oh so much, and that's burning me out. It helps people break down the beliefs themselves, get a view of the systems within which they're experiencing burnout, so that they can make more sustainable changes. Because some folks, we really ought not to tell them to cope well with the situation. They're in a very unjust situation that they ought to be burnt out and upset about. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, it's meant to help folks, just if people wanted to have an example of what it looks like to try to break down some of these ideas, break down some of these beliefs and find that liberation. That's a really great starting point with some exercises in there.
Awesome. I love that. And where did the name Mockingbird come from?
Okay, so a couple of things. I had wanted to have something that tied into like trauma healing and social justice. And I had loved, like, I feel like we all read as kids that To Kill a Mockingbird, where the mockingbird is just someone who's trying to sing and you're not supposed to. It's this sadness around the world hurting folks who are just trying to live, just these beautiful folks that are just trying to live and put nice things out there in the world. And it just reminded me so much of like the clients I see. They're just lovely people that are facing big storms that you wish they weren't in. And it just feels like a crime, the things that some of them have been through. And for some, it literally is a crime. And I kind of wanted something that spoke to that social justice side. And that book was one of the first times I really started thinking about ideas like that as a kid. So I really appreciate it still to this day, just for getting me started on that journey of awareness. I also chose it because it felt like I picked it out of my short list because when we moved to our first home, there's a pair of mockingbirds that live in our front yard, and they hang out on the
Oh,
little like stone windowsills of my office. And I was like, oh, it's a sign. I should name my business after them. And this was before I realized that they're kind of jerks. Like not kind yard neighbors. They
oh
dive
no.
bomb my dog, and they're very possessive over a yard that I pay the bank a lot of money to have.
Oh no.
I pay the bank a lot to live in this home, but these two birds are very convinced that they own it. And so, but yes, by then the paperwork had gone through, so the name stuck. So they get to maintain the name of the business too. But yes, they are in
That's
real
too
life,
funny.
but they're jerks.
That's like funny and ironic all at the same time.
Right? I was like, you are supposed to be a symbol. They didn't get the message that
They
they're
didn't get,
supposed to be a symbol of
yeah,
justice.
they
They're just
definitely didn't
doing
get the
their thing.
message.
Yeah.
And just because, I work with an insurance brain, do you take insurance?
I do. For Texas residents, I can take insurance for individual therapy. Coaching, you got to pay out of pocket for that. Insurance has no part of that. But yeah,
Right.
for anybody who's a Texas resident, I can accept, oh, what am I paneled with right now? Aetna, Optum, and United. So those three. Yeah.
Good
Yeah.
deal. And you do virtual visits, I'm assuming too.
Yes, I absolutely love that. I do virtual care right now. So the nice thing about that is people can sign in from anywhere and they don't have to do
Yes.
any of the traffic. And there's also something really nice. I feel like there's this added humanness to virtual care, that people actually get to just sign in from their life. Like folks, when they're anxious, they'll have like their dog sitting in their lap while they're doing therapy, or we'll both be coming from our coffee makers, having made a fresh cup of coffee, and we'll sit down for session. There's also some really cool research, just as like a fun side fact, which is in the work health world, we tend to do a lot less code switching and we experience less pressure to have to put on masks and be inauthentic when we're working from home. Fun fact. So I absolutely really love, and I've experienced this myself, this way that you get to be just a little bit more authentic, a little bit more at ease when you're in your own spaces. And so there's something really lovely about integrating that into therapy, where instead of folks having to meet me in some like fluorescently lit hospital office, like we get to actually sign in from our own personal spaces and meet in this way that feels just more like intimate and lovely and human. And they will occasionally hear sounds of like the toddler in the background through the walls, or like we'll hear each other's dogs bark here and there. And there's something nice about it because I feel like it reminds us that like it brings that humanness back into therapy in a way that I really missed in hospital settings.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, I'm pretty sure most of us are not a fan of hospitals. So
No.
100% get what you're saying.
Yeah, no, the pandemic was when I went from occasionally doing virtual care to like all virtual. And oh, yeah, it was there. I can't imagine a situation now where I would ever go back to full-time working outside of the home. I absolutely love my virtual life.
Yeah.
It's great. Like I have all 3 meals a day with my kids. We go on morning nature walks, and then I see patients and get to show up to patients as like a full, healthy human being. And yeah, yeah, it's a nice way to be. I'm really glad that like I feel very lucky to live in a time where this is something we can do. Like it can be a reality of our work lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, thank you so much, Jackie, for being here. It was a pleasure having you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. And absolutely, thank you so much for the questions you ask. And just it's so nice to the way you think about things and the way that you just ask with such sincerity, like the way that you interact with your guests on this show shows so much heart. You're trying to actually understand people coming in and get into these beautiful stories we're all living so that you can share that with your guests. And it's really lovely. I'm glad I stumbled upon you and your podcast. I will be tuning in from now on because it is just absolutely lovely.
Oh, thank you so much. That was so kind, and it makes me so happy. That's what I'm here
Yeah.
for.
Thank you for bringing all of our humanness together. I think we all really need it.
The collective. We need to all be together. Absolutely. And this is how to deal when the shit gets real, guys. I'll see you all next episode.